A member of Israel's war cabinet, Benny Gantz, has threatened to quit if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't outline a post-war plan for Gaza by early next month. There is also pressure from protesters who are calling for early elections and demanding that the government do more to negotiate the release of the remaining captives held in Gaza. Netanyahu's government has, of course, shut down Al Jazeera's operations in Israel, which is why our correspondent Mohammed Jamjoom is reporting from the Jordanian capital, Amman.
On Saturday in Tel Aviv, demonstrators once again came out by the thousands. Many demanding Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu resign. Others urging him to do whatever is needed to bring their loved ones home.
We are here not only this evening, but 7 months. First of all, to make a pressure on our government, forbid a bloody government, to get back all the hostages.
At one point, authorities using a water cannon to disperse anti-government protesters. Anger and angst in equal measure, all in the wake of news that the Israeli forces operating in Gaza had recovered the body of another captive, Ron Binyamin. The Israeli army attempted to project strength, even releasing a video it says shows combat operations in eastern Rafah. But for the country's political leadership, on display was division and discord. At a news conference, War Cabinet member Benny Gantz threatening to resign from the government if a new 6-point plan for the war in Gaza isn't adopted within weeks.
At the fateful crossroads where we are at now, the leadership must see the big picture to identify risks and identify opportunities, formulate an updated national strategy so that we can fight shoulder to shoulder. The War Cabinet must form a 6-point plan by June 8 to bring home our hostages, to eliminate the Hamas regime, and demarcate the Gaza Strip to ensure Israeli security control.
Gantz's comments coming just days after Defense Minister Yoav Gallant called on Netanyahu to oppose Israeli military rule in Gaza and to make clear his post-war plans. While the demonstrations continue to gather momentum and while more members of his war cabinet publicly criticize the prime minister, it seems Netanyahu is feeling the most amount of pressure from the far right-wing flank of his coalition. People like National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who for months have threatened to collapse his government if Netanyahu doesn't commit to going full force into Rafah. Mohammed Jamjoom, Al Jazeera, Amman.
Let's get more on this. We can speak to Eran Etzion. He's a former deputy head of Israel's National Security Council. He joins us from Mevasarat Zion in Israel, which is near West Jerusalem. Thank you for your time, sir. What does Benny Gantz's ultimatum mean for Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Hi, good to be here. Well, I'm afraid it's very complicated to explain to those who are not very much familiar with the intricacies of the Israeli political system. Gantz is allegedly a contender against Netanyahu in the upcoming elections, but he is part of his coalition that he joined immediately after October 7th in an effort to assist the war effort. In any case, what he's doing now, he's trying to differentiate himself from the prime minister in view of upcoming elections. But if you examine closely the 6 points that he enumerated, they're not really a challenge for Netanyahu. There is not a lot of a difference between Gantz's agenda for the continuation of the war and the so-called end state in Gaza and Netanyahu's endgame, at least on paper. The real problem is that Netanyahu is serving his own peculiar personal, political, and judicial interests because, as we all know, he's facing a criminal trial and he's facing deposition in the upcoming elections. So he's doing everything he can to avoid going back to the public. That is essentially what is going on, and it's a political game, much more than a strategic competition.
Right. So in terms of when Gantz is threatening to step down, you don't think that's a real, genuine threat?
I think Gantz has shown a lot of hesitation throughout his political career, and he has shown it in his speech last night. He has formulated his agenda in a way that allows Netanyahu still to accept it. On the one hand, and on the other, he is, again, in real concrete terms, because there is not a lot of a difference between him and Netanyahu, if indeed we go for elections, it's going to be less on the intricacies of the strategic agenda and more on the question of who is the leader that Israel needs. Is it still Netanyahu? Is it Gantz? Or is it somebody else?
Then you have the Americans, whose attempt to pressure Netanyahu also appears to be going nowhere. You have White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in Israel today. I mean, what are your thoughts on, what is going on behind the scenes when it comes to the United States?
The Americans have been pushing to end the war via hostage deal, which is an avenue to what they call the Biden plan, which we all know is extremely ambitious, but points to a historic opportunity all the way to the Saudi-U.S.-Israeli normalization deal, which is indeed historic in terms of its proportions, its content, its promise. But the distance between what the Americans are aspiring to and what certainly Netanyahu and to a large extent also Gantz are willing to actually state and do is huge. And the Americans understand it, perhaps belatedly. So they're here in almost a last-ditch effort to try and persuade, I guess, both Netanyahu and Gantz to kind of jump on this moving wagon of the US-Saudi deal. Mm-hmm. I doubt very much that they will succeed. And the real problem is that on the ground, we have a raging war, both in Gaza, but also in the north between Israel and Hezbollah, which is threatening to spill over into a full-fledged regional war. What has stopped it so far is American opposition, American veto on Israel, and American pressures and deterrence messages to Iran and Hezbollah. One should hope very much that this American deterrence will hold, because if it doesn't, we're looking at a near-term catastrophe on multiple fronts.
I mean, we've seen in recent days the Israeli military re-enter areas of northern Gaza previously declared clear of Hamas. I just wonder, is that not raising doubts, queries at all about the government's strategy for eliminating the group, whether that be within the government or with the people themselves?
There are a lot of doubts, certainly within the wider Israeli public, and as is becoming more and more evident, even within the wider Israeli cabinet and within the smaller so-called war cabinet in Israel, between the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister, between both of them and Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, who are ministers without portfolio, as we said, from the so-called opposition that joined the coalition. There are multiple differences and very, very strong disagreements between those politicians at the highest levels, and also between them and the military. And it's an evolution, because when the war started, there was much more of a cohesion, and the more the war lingers, and the more we are faced with a very difficult reality of anything but the so-called total victory that Netanyahu promised and keeps on promising, it creates more and more disunity. And what it should do in a healthy democracy is lead to general election in which there will be hopefully a totally new government with a totally new strategy. In that case, which is the more positive scenario, the way I see it, we will still have at least 3 to 4 months of a transitional government, which will be a very dangerous period for obvious reasons.
Okay. Good to get your perspective. Eran Etzion, former deputy head of Israel's National Security Council. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, joining us here in the studio is Mohammed Al-Masri. He is a political analyst and professor of media studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Good to have you again, Mohammed. You were listening into that conversation. It feels like we are at an impasse here, because, I mean, clearly we have these divisions within the Israeli war cabinet growing, but as we heard from our guests there, nothing seems to be really rattling Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he's got the far right on his side, hasn't he?
Right. I mean, he's certainly getting pressure from people like Benny Gantz and Yoav Gallant, and also pressure from the United States. but I think the more important pressure is the pressure that he gets from the far right, from people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, because his political survival depends more on them than on anyone else. And so he's been sort of unwilling to bend to any of these other pressures. And, you know, I thought it was interesting listening to Benny Gantz and his 6-point plan. And I agree with the guest who said there's really not a lot there. I mean, the very first point is the dismantling of Hamas, which experts the world over have been saying for 7.5 months is completely unrealistic, right? So from what I can gather, Benny Gantz is also calling for a forever war, a perpetual war on the Gaza Strip. And that certainly doesn't represent a lot of difference from Netanyahu.
So where do we go from here? I mean, we have Jake Sullivan. He's been in Saudi Arabia. He's now in Israel. Is there, I mean, what more could the United States be doing?
Well, the United States has all of the leverage. The United States could have ended this, before it started. The United States is always one phone call away from ending this war. They have all the leverage with Israel. They could simply tell Israel that we're not going to supply you with weapons. Israel would not be able to survive without...
But it's pretty clear they're not going to go that far.
Well, at this point, no, they're not going to go that far. And I think we're just in an abyss right now, quite frankly. And there's an increasing acknowledgement, even from within Israeli circles, that Israel is not winning this war. In fact, I thought it was interesting. There's a former Mossad deputy chief who's named Ram Ben Barak, who came out with really interesting comments this weekend. He said that Israel is losing this war, quote, unequivocally, and he challenged the government and Israeli citizens to provide him with even one thing that Israel has succeeded in. So there's acknowledgement that Israel's losing the war. Even Benny Gantz is acknowledging it implicitly by trying to cast blame on Netanyahu, yet no one has any sort of vision for the way forward. No one is willing to talk about the root causes of the conflict, the root causes of the October 7th attack. No one wants to talk about the siege on Gaza or the occupation or Palestinian self-determination or the lack thereof. And therefore, here we are.
We had the Qataris for a long time really sort of trying to drive some sort of negotiation, but even that seems to have stalled.
Yeah, I mean, we're at the same sticking point. You know, Hamas is demanding an end to the war. They see it as a genocidal assault on the Gaza Strip. There have been 35,000 plus fatalities. They want an end to the war. Israel, as we've seen with Netanyahu, with Gallant, with Gantz, the entire war cabinet, they are all promising to continue the war until Hamas is completely dismantled, which, as I've said, and as many analysts have said, seems to be, at least as we sit here today, completely unrealistic.
Okay, Mohammed, hopefully the next time we talk, we'll have something slightly more positive to discuss. Mohammed Al-Masri, political analyst and professor of media studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.